Welcome to the webinar book launch of The Case for a New Bretton Woods, hosted by the Boston University Global Development Policy Center and the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. The Boston University Global Development Policy Center is a university-wide research center that works to advance policy-oriented research for financial stability, human well-being, and environmental sustainability across the globe. The United Nations Conference on Trade and Development seeks to maximize the trade, investment, and development opportunities of developing countries and assist them in their efforts to integrate into the world economy on an equitable basis. My name is Bill Kring. I'm the Executive Director of the Boston University Global Development Policy Center, and I will be moderating our discussion today. In the aftermath of World War II, the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference convened in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, with the goal of designing an interdependent economic architecture for mutual prosperity. Based on a set of common principles of peace, equity, and employment, the International Monetary Fund and precursors to the World Bank and World Trade Organization were established to support the provision of global public goods, institutions that in their present form have loomed large in the global economy since their inception. But the disjointed nature of the response to the COVID-19 pandemic in deferment of crucial climate action has revealed a multilateral system in need of fundamental reform. In the echoes of the 1930s, the international community cannot coordinate well enough to provide global public goods for stability and prosperity or combat right-wing populism and footloose finance. Now, the book, The Case for the New Bretton Woods by Kevin P. Gallagher and Richard Causell-Wright makes the case for a new Bretton Woods moment, wherein the international economic institutions of the 20th century undergo sweeping reforms to promote a more prosperous, just, and sustainable world economic order, fit for the 21st century. Published by Polity Press, the book outlines a set of principles for a new multilateralism in a blueprint for change across three critical areas of global economic governance: the international financial system, trade and investment, and development finance. We are joined today by Richard Causell-Wright, who will discuss the book's key takeaways. Richard is Director of Globalization and Development Strategies Division in the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. He's worked at the UN in both New York and Geneva and published widely on economic issues, including in the Economic Journal, the Cambridge Journal of Economics, and the Journal of Development Studies. He has co-written books such as The Resistible Rise of Market Fundamentalism and co-edited volumes of Transnational Corporations in the Global Economy and Economic Insecurity and Development. Also joining us are three international experts who will provide reactions and remarks based on the book. Winnie Byanyima is the Executive Director of UNAIDS and Undersecretary General of the United Nations, a passionate and longstanding champion of social justice and gender equality. Winnie leads the United Nations efforts to end the AIDS epidemic by 2030. Before joining UNAIDS, Winnie served as the Executive Director of Oxfam International and served 11 years in the Ugandan Parliament. Daniela Gabor is Associate Professor in Economics at the University of West of England, Bristol. She holds a PhD in Banking and Finance from University of Stirling. Since then, she has published on central banking and crisis, the governance of global banks in the IMF, and shadow banking and repo markets. Jayati Ghosh is a professor of economics at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst since January of 2021. In 2021, the United Nations named her to be on the high-level advisory board of economics and social affairs. She is the executive secretary of International Development Economics Associates, an international network of heterodox development economists. She has authored and or edited 19 books and nearly 200 scholarly articles. Now, before turning it over to our panelists, I want to mention that this webinar is being live streamed on YouTube, so a recording will be immediately accessible to those who are not able to join us or want to revisit the discussion. Please use the Q&A box located in your Zoom menu to ask your questions to the panelists. Please also provide your name and affiliation, and we will take questions after the panelists' remarks. But feel free to enter your questions at any time during the discussion. Thank you, and now over to you, Richard.
Bill, thanks a lot for the introduction, and welcome to everybody. The book and obviously Kevin unfortunately can't be with us, and so, which is a loss that we face. But I guess I speak on his behalf a little bit. The book is essentially an exercise in constructive provocation. It's a short book. It's not an academic book. It's an attempt to provoke debate and constructive debate. And I'm not going to speak for a long time because I think we've got three great panelists who we want to engage with on the kind of issues that you nicely set up for us, Bill, in your introduction, that we desperately need a functioning multilateral system, given the kind of challenges that we face across development, inequality, climate, health challenges. I mean, countries can't solve the problems that we face acting in isolation, but we don't have a multilateralism that seems to be able to deal with these kinds of issues in a timely and effective manner. And I mean, the book tries to provide a kind of potted history of why we think we've got to a situation where, after having multilateralism in place essentially for 100 years now, it doesn't seem to be able to deliver. I mean, there's a conventional story about a kind of perfecting of governance arrangements that go through the troubled birth of the League of Nations and the emergence of the Bretton Woods around US hegemony, to the current situation of a rules-based international market order that has somehow got the sovereignty, leadership, and distributional issues more or less correct, with ongoing concerns about populist forces and protectionist forces and cultural forces, about people being left behind and things. That's not the story that we have in the book. We have a much more punctuated history in which it's the rules of the game that are the problem as much as anything else. The Bretton Woods was a rupture from the League of Nations that not only created a dedicated set of institutions to manage trade, finance, investment flows, but also had a very different set of principles and policies and goals in mind to do that. It's not a book about heroes and villains, this book, but if there's a hero in the Bretton Woods story that we have, it's probably surprisingly Henry Morgenthau, as much as it is Keynes or Harry Dexter White. We are very much a fan of the way in which Morgenthau defended the Bretton Woods institutions at the Monetary and Finance Committee of the US House of Representatives. He set down a very clear set of principles for what he thought the system should be delivering, and which I think are worth adhering to still. If there's a villain in the story, it's probably Paul Volcker. Volcker, of course, was part of the cabal that started the Nixon shock that began the dismantling of the fixed exchange rate system in 1971, and had his own shock himself at the end of the decade with the rise of US interest rates, that he himself described as a necessary part of a controlled disintegration of the global economy, setting it up for a very different set of policies, principles, a different narrative of trade-offs and priorities. The institutions, of course, that had been created at Bretton Woods remained in place, but the internal plumbing was fundamentally changed from the early 1980s onwards. And I guess most people here know that story about the rise of the Washington Consensus and some of its more recent iterations, what Daniela herself calls the Wall Street Consensus, as the more virulent strain of that Washington Consensus. But they're all, in one way or another, about protecting private economic activity from the interference of government and policymakers, and ensuring the integrity of the profit-making process as the best way of organizing and structuring economic life. And the book, it's not only that we think that system that emerged post-1980 is not really fit for purpose in terms of delivering on the challenges that we face today. It hasn't really delivered on the promises it made itself. about what it was going to deliver in terms of stability, in terms of a vibrant investment environment, productive investment environment, boosting productivity growth. None of these things have really emerged out of the system, the post-Bretton Woods system. And given that on top of that, we have the new challenges, we do agree with Georgieva that we need a new Bretton Woods moment. That's partly because we need to break with the neoliberalism that has infected the operations of the multilateral system, but it also to some extent that we do make a case for recovering some of the older principles that had animated the Bretton Woods, the original Bretton Woods design, whilst avoiding mistakes that were made at that time. And we're very conscious of the mistakes that were made as well in the original Bretton Woods operations. We could not but talk about that because UNCTAD itself, where I work, was born out of the frustration of many developing countries with the way in which the original model was working in the 1950s and the 1960s. So I mean, so it's not a story about starting from scratch. The institutions that were created were a major triumph for the international community, and we're not going to have, unfortunately, a system that starts from ground zero. That's not the world in which we live. So we have to build on what we have, but we need to make some fundamental changes to deal with the new challenges as well as the challenges that these institutions themselves have created, or these problems and challenges these institutions have created themselves over the course of the last 40 years of their operation. So what the book then tries to do is to spell out some changes to the international monetary and financial system, a system that was set up to ensure sufficient liquidity and stability to generate a smooth financial system, to deal with global imbalances that did not resort to austerity as the default response to reducing imbalances, a World Bank that whose job is essentially to provide reliable sources of international public finance for large-scale investment pushes, and particularly of a developmental nature, but not only of a developmental nature, and of course some kind of institution to boost and manage trade in a fair and an effective manner through negotiated agreements across member states and the monitoring of those and adjudication of any disputes that are right. We need that system. These are institutions that we desperately need. We just don't think, we do think there are a number of changes that need to be made at all levels, and we identify essentially 3 levels in the book around governance, around alignment issues, and around systemic issues, where we offer some proposals to hopefully make these institutions more effective and in line with the challenges of the 21st century. And I don't want to go through in any great detail those changes, but just to give a flavor of what we try and suggest. In the case of the International Monetary Fund, I mean, there are some what should be very basic governance changes that need to be made about how leadership is chosen, how decision-making is made around the quota system, reporting exercises that are 75 years old now and are clearly inconsistent with the world in which we currently face. There are more difficult alignment challenges about getting the instruments and policies in line with the new goals that we need to achieve, whether through the Sustainable Development Goals or we make a proposal for a global Green New Deal. And that involves issues around special drawing rights. And obviously we've been encouraged by the recent changes that we've seen last year of a new allocation, but there are a lot of additional reforms that need to be made to make SDRs a more effective tool in the international financial system. We need to see capital controls at both ends of the transaction, both inflows and outflows, given the instability that speculative flows now cause and the damage particularly to developing countries. But again, not only. We need to see better monitoring of systemically important players in the international financial system. That still hasn't been solved. And we need to deal with the conditionality problems that have plagued the policy advice that the fund has given over decades, and developing countries continue to complain bitterly about. So there's a whole set of alignment issues there that we try and outline and offer alternatives for. And there are still systemic issues that need to be dealt with, of which the most important right now is the debt issue. This is an old UNCTAD issue that has not been properly resolved over the course of the last 4 decades. Too little, too late remains the basic operation when it comes to managing sovereign debt problems. And without a serious tackling of that side of the international financial system, it's very difficult to see delivery of the kind of goals that we talk about under the Global Green New Deal or the Sustainable Development Goals agendas. So there's a lot of governance, alignment, systemic issue, and much the same goes for the World Bank, where the problems are more, I mean, the governance issues are very much the same, of course, but there are some difficult systemic issues around scaling up the public finance side of the World Bank operations. We are not in favor of blending finance. We're not in favor of public-private partnerships. Public goods, and in particular global public goods, need to properly resourced global public finance mechanisms, and we need a much more honest discussion about what that means if we're going to meet these global public good problems, and we have some proposals for that. And with the WTO, where at least the governance in principle is a more balanced system, there are lots of biases and procedural problems that need to be urgently tackled to bring trust back into the system. The Doha development round needs to be completed. We need a serious discussion of special and differential treatment, which is an integral part of any sort of fair and functioning trading system. We need, from an alignment point of view, I think we need to talk about rolling back certain areas. I'm sure Winnie will talk about the vaccine scandal, where intellectual property right has been detrimental to what is clearly a global public health problem. But it's IPRs cause problems not just for health, they're going to cause problems in the climate challenge as well. And rolling back that side of the trade, it's not a trade story anyway, it shouldn't be in a trading system. It needs to be dealt with urgently. We also need to roll forward. The international trading system is dominated by very large monopolistic players. We don't have the antitrust, anti-monopoly legislation in place to deal with that properly. I think we need to see changes in those fronts. So there's a whole set of alignment, governance, systemic issues that we try and outline. And just finally, of course, in all this story, and we need to think much harder about the politics of multilateralism. Lots of people in our system don't like to talk about the politics of multilateralism, but it's a power game at the end of the day, and we need to be honest about the challenges that poses. We need to talk about dollar hegemony a little bit more honestly and the problems that poses for a more balanced system, and we need to talk about countervailing power and where that's going to come from, given the huge imbalances in economic and political power that have emerged to distort the system over the last 2 or 3 decades. So there's a big political agenda that's kind of a little bit hidden in the book, but I think has to be the basis for a more open and frank discussion of moving forward to meet the challenges that we face. So thank you. Thanks, Bill. I think I went over a bit.
Thank you, Richard. All right, on to Winnie.
Thank you. Thank you, moderator, colleagues, friends. I'm delighted to join you for this panel today. Inequalities are spiraling and global crises are compounding each other. We see clearly that the dominant economic and financial models and institutions are unable to respond equitably or effectively. That's very clear. It's immoral, it's absurd, it's self-defeating that we have not vaccinated the world or enabled people, especially in the developing countries, to cope with the shocks, and that even more people are set to die from the economic impact of the crisis than from COVID itself. And as all this happens, the 10 richest men have doubled their wealth last year. It's just absurd. This failure is not just a feature. It's a feature. It's a feature of the system. It's not a bug. It's clear now that the only realistic approach is a radical transformation of the model so that it is rooted more in the common good. It delivers a human economy and democratic accountability. What could that look like in terms of the international financial system? What is the path we need to be making? This vital book helps light the way, and I congratulate you, Richard and Kevin, on it. You've produced a timely and essential contribution. My 4 highlights from the book are these. First, the original Bretton Woods agreements have been undermined. Stability, protection from crises, cooperation, preventing large deficits and surpluses were core to the founding agreement, as Richard said, as was protecting people from a too strong power of private banking. All these were fundamentals. Secondly, as US Treasury Secretary Morgenthau stated in 1944, the success of Bretton Woods was to be measured to the extent to which capital served the general welfare. But neoliberalism has gutted even the idea of the general welfare. Who talks about that anymore? We have evidence-free faith in the markets, and private capital has normalized policies designed only to provide what they call an attractive investment environment. All this obstructing workers' rights, hampering social progress, and weakening the negotiating power of ordinary people. Third highlight from the book, the weakness of the Bretton Woods system to process debt crises, minimal debt restructuring, a cumbersome and lawless system, the unsuccessful common framework, and private creditors let off the hook, enabled to collect profits while millions continue to be pushed into poverty, out of healthcare and education. Fourth highlight, how to transform Bretton Woods. The principles of the system need to be profoundly revised to advance welfare, job creation, an economy that thrives within planetary boundaries, rules for fair taxation and sufficient collection, action to crack down on corruption, and a system for managing debt shocks, protecting developing countries from financial markets. You've spoken so well to these in the book. Kevin and Richard, you've uncovered the past and provided a vision for a positive, alternative future, a possible future. Your evidence is overwhelming, but as we know, evidence is not enough. A vision that is this bold will never simply be read and implemented by those in power. That will depend on all of us citizens, civil society, you in academia, media, helping to build the pressure to win the transformation that we need. Thank you, Kevin and Richard. Sorry, Kevin, you're not here, for your guidebook for the fairer and secure future that we all deserve. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Winnie. And now over to Jayati.
Thank you so much, and also for inviting me to be part of this discussion on what is truly a really important book, topical, important, necessary. So I think, already Richard has identified all of the important points that are made in the book, and Winnie has very beautifully provided a background. So I don't need to say very much. I just want to highlight that, three things that really stand out for me about all the proposals that are made in this book. The urgency of them. They really have to happen soon, quickly, immediately, yesterday. The desirability, it's obvious. I don't need to play on that, but it's obviously desirable. But also that these are all viable. These are not some incredibly, blue sky crazy thinking. These are all things that can be done, some of which were done in the past, so that they are not impossible to imagine, even as policy measures. It's absolutely true that the current multilateralism is not just unworkable. The book identifies it clearly. Winnie has identified it again. It's unjust, it's unequal, it's inefficient, it's even deadly, for people and planet, right? So we know that this is bad news. We also know that this is what is making people across the world turn against multilateralism. In other words, they are seeing a global system of rules that doesn't benefit them, that actually operates against their interests quite often. And we have to admit something which is implicit in the book, but it's important to note when we're talking about how we deal with this, is that legal codes are making this much more difficult. Unlike earlier multilateralism of the 50s, 60s, 70s, this is now embedded in very strict legal codes that dramatically privilege large capital and make it much more difficult to confront. Basically make it easier for empire to strike back, if you like, and to preserve its own power. And I think this is a very important part of looking for the alternatives. In terms of what has to be done, the book highlights them very beautifully. We know what are the changes that need to be made. The question really is, why isn't it happening? And here again, they bring in towards the end, Richard and Kevin bring in the whole issue of countervailing power. It's something that Richard talked about as well just now, that, this is really a power game. Multilateralism is a power game. And so two things are critically important. One is the fact that there is, the exercise of relative power at all levels of international negotiations. This is true within the existing international organizations and multilateral institutions, of course, WTO, etc. But it's also true at all the negotiating tables. We've just seen this at COP26 in Glasgow. We are seeing this in the OECD attempts at tax reform, which are pitiful to say the least. So essentially, it is the relative power of large capital versus everybody else, expressed through states that choose to project the interests of large capital, that is inhibiting any real change. How do we do that? How do we confront this? And I think there are two critical aspects of this, which I'm assuming that we're speaking to a bunch of like-minded people. We all recognize the problems. We all want to do something about it. We all are groping for ways in which to do this. I think first big problem is the control of the narrative. Unfortunately, we still are unable to get this message across to a sufficiently wide part of the global population. And this is why books like this are so important, actually, because they are readable, they are approachable for the average person. And I would say you need to be translating this, you need to be putting it out there and using other means to get these messages across. Control over the narrative is essential, but of course we also know we're dealing with a largely corporatized global media that doesn't want you to project this narrative. So that's only one part of the story. The second part is that how do we then begin? Because, every time we say, well, let's set up an institution, a global institution to do this, a global social protection fund, a global public investment fund, a global vaccine effort, etc., we find that it is either distorted or captured by the same powers that we're trying to be countervailing against, and so on. So what do we do in this context where anything global becomes something that is immediately taken over by large capital, proxied by the major governments, the sort of important governments in the world. So here is where I think we have to now think a little bit beyond multilateralism. In other words, to preserve multilateralism, maybe we have to begin with regionalism. Maybe we have to begin with different ways of chipping away at this. Begin with different kinds of coalitions that don't necessarily always seek to use the same institutions, because we are seeing how each one of them then changes, gets distorted in terms of how it plays out. I am sort of thinking, not in a very well-developed way, but it is something we're all grappling with. How do we confront this massive behemoth, this octopus that sort of grabs everything that is out there designed to reform it or alter it and twists it to its own purposes? How do we confront this? And I think we have to confront this by not thinking in its own terms, by not always thinking only in terms of changing a global rule, but by bringing in different elements that can actually provide alternatives in different ways. I'm thinking of, for example, the possibility that maybe a Cuban vaccine will emerge as a people's vaccine. I'm hoping that the WHO approves this. I'm hoping that it becomes something that more and more people across the world have access to. I'm thinking of possibilities which the African Union and others are showing more and more of regional strategies for developing capacities for drug development and production, for genomic research, for other things. I'm thinking of industrialization efforts that rely on regional groupings. I'm thinking of regional attempts at monetary and other arrangements that provide some buffer to the massive capital shocks. I'm thinking actually even of financial regulations implemented not necessarily at a national level, but at a regional level, to provide some kind of protection against the massive volatility of global capital flows that prevents governments from doing anything reasonable for their own people. So there are many ways in which we could think of this, but I'm putting it out there that maybe one of the ways to fight the sort of pernicious multilateralism that we see today is through an internationalism that is based on enabling new forms of particular alternative strategies to emerge at national, regional, cross-country levels that can confront that kind of pernicious multilateralism. Okay, let me stop here because I'm sure there'll be much more interesting things to be said by Daniela. Thanks.
Thank you so much. On to Daniela.
Thank you. It's quite a challenge to follow up after two brilliant women. And on a book that one has so much to agree with. I mean, the book calls for talking about the developmental state. Again, I think it's very important. There is a growing interest in the developmental state, and that should be reflected in how we talk about the comeback of the state. I think that's a point that the book makes very powerfully. Then the discussion about governments who are kind of giving too much of the leadership to private finance. I think it's also an important point to bear in mind. But I thought, particularly in the spirit of what Richard called constructive provocation, maybe I'll try to open up a constructive dialogue that might be a little bit provocative, and make a point about ideas and ideology and a point about structure. And let me start with a point about ideas and ideology. I was reading yesterday, incidentally, for another conversation, I was reading about the debates between Keynes and White in the run-up to the design of the Bretton Woods institutions, and the powerful force that animated Keynes's views of how we should design Bretton Woods institutions was that they should be designed in order to fight against the deflationary pressures that he had seen before and during the Second World War in the UK. And it's quite paradoxical that we have ended up with the Bretton Woods institutions that are reproducing and pushing deflationary pressures in the economies. Anybody who has lived through an IMF standby agreement will know what I'm talking about, or through structural adjustment. And I wanted to ask the authors in that spirit, what kind of macroeconomic ideas, or how do we rethink the ideological and ideational support that we have, or tools that we have, in order to design particularly the low carbon transition? If we recognize that we live through an age of ecological exceptionalism, that we countries in the global north mostly benefited from that age of ecological exceptionalism, what kind of economic ideas are necessary now to sort of make sure that we redesign our economies in a way that is consistent with managing the climate crisis? So that would be my question about ideas and ideologies. What would the new Bretton Woods institution take as important, or put forward as important, macroeconomic ideas? And then I want to talk a little bit about structures, right? And this just because I can't have an interventions without talking about my favorite Wall Street consensus bet. And I was struck by something that Richard said. He said that multilateralism doesn't work. And if we look very carefully, I mean, even if you read just the Financial Times, I think I would like to put forward another idea, and that is that what the system that we have now in place does work, but it works for a very specific set of economic actors. And I would say that it works for financial capital, or for financial capitalism. As a good friend of mine put it, Ndongo Sambasila, he said that we could describe the Wall Street consensus, which is this idea that we live in a new development paradigm that gives or relies on private finance in order to achieve the sustainable development goals or any public policy ideas. He described this as Bretton Woods for asset managers. And I think that's a very powerful description, because the system that we have in place now is providing liquidity and stability, as Richard put it, for institutional capital, for institutional investors like pension funds, insurance companies, for asset managers like BlackRock, for private equity funds like Blackstone. And this is the system that we have in place. It is functioning, but only for a very small set of economic actors with great structural and infrastructural power. And I would like, if Richard has a time to respond to this, I would like to think through, if we took Henry Morgenthau's proposal seriously, that we have to discipline financial capital in this case, instead of mobilizing or leveraging or relying on it to achieve our development priorities, what would this disciplining look like? We can discuss the political economy of disciplining them, but even the limits of the imagination that we have in terms of disciplining capital, I think we need to think very carefully through them. Is it enough to just play with capital controls, particularly if you think of what's happened through the last year and a half, when countries in Africa have refused to apply to the DSSI, to the Debt Service Suspension Initiative, in the name of market access? So can we just tinker at the margin, or are we talking about very serious structural reforms of globalized finance? And what does that look like? And then comes the very difficult question of how do you mobilize political will to implement this kind of changes? And I think that's in a sense, it's a much more difficult question, because it goes back to political economy of their power. I'll stop here so we have some time for discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much to our distinguished panelists. What I'm going to do, Richard, is present about 3 questions from the Q&A, and we'll have that be the first round, and then we'll come back with some more questions until we run out of time. Pamela Blackman, Associate Professor of Political Science at Pennsylvania State University, Altoona, asks, does the book also address proposed changes to the growing role of Paris Club debt rescheduling, and especially creditor states' export rate credit agencies, as affecting developing countries' debt problems? Veronica Wartz, Boston University School of Public Health, asks, do you see the US as one of the countries that needs to take leadership in this reform? And 2, President Biden announced yesterday that he wants to talk to researchers and think tanks. How can the new Bretton Woods be part of these talks that are going to be held? And then the last question for this round, Chris Hopkins from the Green Economy Coalition asks if the institutional and political economy pendulum has swung as far as it can or should away from Bretton Woods type suitable multilateral system and now must return. Must this be a gradual return swing? What would an incremental path feel like, and what would a sudden reversion look like? We'll start with those three questions.
Bill, thanks. I mean, we don't talk about the Paris Club, and we don't extensively talk about the role of credit rating agencies, although both Kevin has done work on this and UNCTAD is certainly doing work on this, where we are members of the Paris Club. So it doesn't figure in this discussion. The role of credit, I think the role of credit rating agencies is incredibly important. That's something that needs to be urgently visited, because I think they do play a damaging role in this system, and there's clearly a conflict of interest in the way in which they operate, and there have been proposals for public credit rating agencies of some kind. Some people have argued that the Washington-based institutions should play that role themselves. I think that's an important discussion that needs to be had and to be had quickly. It's not something that we do talk about extensively in this little volume, but I do think it's an important issue. On the role of the US, obviously we've entered this difficult period of the two major powers coming into conflict with each other, and given the nature of the problems we face, that's finding a way to a constructive dialogue between the US and China is clearly very important at this point in time, and the kind of narrative about China that comes out of the advanced economies at the moment is not very constructive and helpful for dealing with the problems that we face. Having said that, I have to say, at least in my world, so from the UNCTAD point of view, I think we find ourselves, at least on certain policy level, having more in common with this current US administration than we've had with previous administrations, to take a critical role. That I think speaks a little bit to Daniela's question before about the whole question of disciplining finance capital. I don't think that is purely a macroeconomic question. So the role of industrial policy, the work that you do around the developmental state, I think one of the forgotten roles of the developmental state when people talk about Korea and Taiwan and these classic examples is that they were very willing to discipline their domestic firms if they somehow stepped out of line. And that's true of China today. I mean, it's true of China today, of course. This is a feature of developmental states, that they do have an agenda in which they have the instruments and the political will to take on capital. And I think industrial policy plays a very important role in that respect. How that might figure in advanced economies such as the US, which are revisiting industrial policy as a necessary tool to make the kind of changes that they want to build back better, or however you want to describe the current agenda, I think is something that is important to watch, as is how that plays out in the multilateral system. I mean, quite clearly, many of the industrial policy instruments that we have championed in UNCTAD have become problematic under current existing trade and investment rules. Not completely. There's a tendency to say that there's no policy space left. I don't think that's true, but there has been a significant restriction on industrial policy instruments, which are important not just from a kind of market efficiency point of view, I think, but from a disciplining capital point of view as well. And I think the resistance to industrial policy comes as much from, I mean, there's all the talk about how they're inefficient and you can't pick, governments can't pick winners, etc., etc. But what worries, and it's we've seen a similar thing with the whole price, I'm sure Daniela knows, with the whole price control debate that has erupted around the contribution of Isabella Weber recently. It's about the political dimension of these policies and the way in which they can impose on private sector decision making. I think that is the real kind of fear of a lot of the opponents of that, rather than the so-called efficiency arguments that are often trotted out in criticizing them. How all that plays, I mean, I think what happens in the US is really going to be important in that discussion. What the US learns from China is, and that's one of the great tragedies, I think. The US can learn from China, I think, about some of the mechanisms that they've used to mobilize and channel resources to make large infrastructure projects successful, etc. And of course, that the fact that we have this level of hostility is not very helpful for that sharing of experiences, not only within the developing world, but across advanced and developing countries. That's something that we need to think hard about, I think. The last point, Bill, about an incremental path. I mean, we obviously we're not where we are. I mean, some of the I'm not sure what I'm not sure about. This gets back to the point that Jayati made, I think, about the kind of strategy about thinking through kind of alternatives. And I like her idea that regionalism may be the best way of bolstering a new multilateralism. Just to flag for those people that are interested, the next issue of the Trade and Development Report, which is the UNCTAD flagship publication on these issues, will tackle the question of regionalization and in its different dimensions, and as a possible stepping stone to refashioning multilateralism. I don't think I have any profound thoughts on that. We would like to think there's an incremental path to improving the system, given some of the points that Jayati made, and given some of the political power asymmetries that we've talked about. I think that's a hard ask. I mean, it's a particularly hard ask in the context of the climate transition, where we know that the carbon economy has some very, very powerful backers, and how we confront those, I think, is a profoundly important question, because these people will not go quietly into their dark night, that's for sure. And so the politics of that are very important.
Thank you, Richard. I think I'll pull 3 more questions from the Q&A, and then I'll allow you and all the panelists a chance to have the final word. The first question comes from Joe Thwaites from the World Resources Institute. What pathways do you see to get major shareholding countries to agree to genuine reforms to the Bretton Woods system, given that it is their majorities on the boards of these institutions that allow them to block significant change? Aftab Alam Khan, CEO of Resilient Future International, says that Pakistan is currently a victim of IMF loans with conditionalities, enormous tax increases, and high inflation. New Bretton Woods institutions must focus on people's benefits in their lives, but what are the options for the people of Pakistan to challenge an agreement like the IMF's agreement? And Emma Burgesser from Christian Aid says there are a lot of proposals on the table for new mechanisms and institutions, such as a public rating agency, a proper global reserve system, a new social protection fund, debt workout mechanism, intergovernmental tax bodies, etc. How do these bodies integrate into your new proposal, and how would you see them relate to the Bretton Woods institutions? And I'll hand it over to Richard and then the panelists for the last word.
I mean, I think a lot of the issue is the issue. It is the issue that Jayati raised about the narrative and controlling the narrative, and the need for a more integrative narrative. I think if you're talking about a progressive economic agenda. I think, you know, organizations like UNCTAD are now struggling to rediscover that narrative as the basis in which we can think about how different proposals can be brought together in an effective way. I mean, just, you know, to a certain extent, it's about, I don't know what to make of the rhetoric of, you know, the current policymakers coming out of COVID-19. Clearly, one of the features of COVID has been a willingness of policymakers to think outside the box a little bit. There are things that people have said and done over the last 2 years that were probably unimaginable a decade ago. It doesn't mean they will last. They could be quite ephemeral, of course. So you know, reacting to the moment doesn't necessarily mean having a long-term strategy for forcing through significant change. And finding the right narrative that can link the immediate challenges of the short term to these long-term transformations will be incredibly important. And I don't think we have that narrative yet. I think we have bits of the narrative in place, but I don't think we really have a consistent narrative. In our work, one of the things, and this speaks maybe to the question of how a country like Pakistan deals with the pressures on it to make kind of adjustments as it enters an IMF program. I mean, clearly there are new players on the block that to some extent act as a countervailing influence. I mean, that's particularly true in the role of finance. China has clearly played that role. And I know there are large debates about China's financing role and important questions to be asked, but it has been a very important shift in the international financial architecture. There are other South-South type mechanisms that have emerged over the course of the last decade that, again, I think need to be part of the discussion. It's not just about multilateralism. I think it's part of these new South-South arrangements that we need to find ways of strengthening those in the way that Jayati suggested in the context of regionalization. And that's something, again, that UNCTAD takes very seriously in the work that we do. We see real opportunities for strengthening South-South mechanisms and learning experiences. And I think the difference between this moment now and the 1970s, when there was a very serious attempt to reform the international architecture through the negotiations around the new international economic order, is clearly that developing countries were much more solidaristic back in the 1970s than they are today. And that did provide very strong countervailing power for a time, and they had the resources to do that as commodity prices were increasing, as access to capital markets was improving. Didn't last, as we know, and as I said, Volcker had a role in that. But in that combination of a narrative of political solidarity and a certain amount of economic strength worked to create an environment for thinking about and to some extent implementing fairly significant changes. And I guess it's about and we need to think about that combination that can be mobilized today to provide a similar sort of momentum to the kind of agenda that marries development challenges with the climate and health challenges and notions around resilience, etc., that we've been hearing a lot about in recent years. I guess at the end of the day, I am a great believer in Bertolt Brecht's phrase that because the things are the way they are, things will not stay the way they are. And the kind of frustrations and anxieties and willingness to mobilize in the case of climate amongst the younger generation has begun to indicate the possibilities of change. And it would be remiss, I think, of people in our world not to tap into those energies and excitement and desire for change. I mean, the real desire for change is there, and we've kind of seen political glimmers of that. The Chilean elections showed signs in which those can come together, those kind of more civil society, the ones that Winnie talked about, of civil society coming together with more traditional political mechanisms and organizations. We will see what happens, but the combination, because of the way things we are seeing the potential for those kinds of changes, and we need to provide the narrative that allows these people to be confident about the kind of changes that they themselves want to make, I think.
Why don't we hand it back over to Winnie, and then we'll go to Jayati and Daniela for final words.
Thank you again. Oxfam released its latest inequality report last week, and it showed that there has been the biggest surge in billionaire wealth since records began. A new billionaire was being created every 26 hours during this pandemic as people died. 160 million people pushed into poverty in the last 2 years. 99% of humanity worse off since the COVID. To me, these point to the urgency of addressing the problems of a rigged economic system, rigged by the rules that have kept changing for the benefit of a few, for the benefit of the holders of capital. 85% of the population in Africa haven't even had 1 dose of that vaccine. In some rich countries, they are moving to the 4th dose, a booster. We are unable to limit carbon emissions, and we are facing climate calamity, and we see it coming because of this crisis in multilateralism. I'm not hopeless, even though I see that we who work at the United Nations keep calling and calling on governments. Our leader, the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, has been calling for a global plan to vaccinate the whole world. It's not impossible. 25 years ago, the world came together and put in place a global plan to fight another pandemic, HIV/AIDS. We still have that global plan. Last year, we renewed that plan, all the countries of the world. There's solidarity behind it to fight AIDS, to end AIDS. We are not yet there, but we've come a long way. 40 million people who are HIV positive, 28 million of them are on treatment and are living healthy lives. We still have a journey. But what I'm saying is that multilateralism can work. This book is a great contribution because it reveals the problems, but also points to the fact that it can work. This political will we must build, and we can build that political will, change the rules, and make the economy work for all people, and build the global public goods that will create a just and sustainable world. Thank you. Kevin and Richard, congratulations on this book. It's an important contribution for activists, for academia, for all citizens. Thank you.
Shall I add?
Please, yes, your closing thought.
Thank you. Yeah. So, yes, thank you, definitely, Kevin and Richard, for this book, and also thank you for organizing this discussion. I want to get onto that question about the pathways. How do you get big countries to agree to any kind of reforms in the Bretton Woods institutions? And I think this ties into a question that Maria Ahmed has asked in the Q&A about basically how do we get countries to reform? And I want to just step back a little bit and highlight one very important difference of the Bretton Woods conference compared to now, which is that then the world had just come out of a very devastating war in which, it was really something that affected almost the entire globe, and where people everywhere realized that they have to cooperate. And I think that's not true today. Today, we are actually in a very different world. We're in a world that is closer to the world described in that pre-war poem of W.H. Auden. If you remember September 1st, 1939, where he's describing, the nations each sequestered in its hate, and where there is so much distrust, suspicion, anger, and basically there is no sense of cooperation. And so we're not getting that lesson, which is also in that poem, if I remember, about how we must love one another or die, which is true. If ever it were true, it is true right now, right? When we are facing all these multiple crises and the potential major catastrophe of climate change engulfing the entire world and destroying the planet and so on. We're not getting that. So I think there is a fundamental difference between the Bretton Woods period and now. Having said that, what does it mean? Does it mean that we're heading for another one of those big global conflagrations and all is lost and so on? I don't think so. I don't think it's necessarily that you have to keep repeating history in exactly the same way, and that it always is going to pan out in that same rather depressing kind of cycle. But I also feel that change doesn't always come from the direction that you're looking at. So maybe, when we keep looking at saying, well, will the US government change? Will the Europeans change? Maybe we're looking in the wrong places. Maybe, that's not where change comes from. And because the world is now so fragmented, because it is so sick, because nations are so sequestered in hate, so because there is so much instability within countries, so much inequality, so much tension, so much fragility of social and economic relations, there are different coalitions emerging that are not always apparent from outside or above or even within in the same way. So yes, young people, I'm continuously inspired by my students, by others who are incredibly brave and wise and able to live with a really horrible world that we are giving to them. But also I think different kinds of coalitions that can emerge, which we may not even be aware of. And I do believe that changes then happen in ways that we haven't predicted from our experience of the pattern of changes in the past. And of course, do I think they will happen? Well, yes, okay, maybe this is being foolish, but I do believe humanity will step back from the brink. Okay, I do believe it. Maybe it's wrong. Maybe I'm, just being over optimistic. And therefore, that stepping back from the brink means that there will be change coming, not necessarily from the directions that we're looking at, but that they will have to be based on some blueprints for the future. And that's why these blueprints that are being provided now, these are so essential as the building blocks of that change. It doesn't have to be in the strategies that we propose. It doesn't have to be through the mechanisms or the institutional changes that we are proposing. It could be much more complicated, much more messy, much more possibly violent in places. But I do believe that they will occur and that we will get some kind of a global new Bretton Woods, new format, if you like, for organizing our economies, our societies, our planet. Thanks.
Thank you. Can I just join the other panelists in congratulating Richard and Kevin for this amazing book? I just want us to remind ourselves that we shouldn't idealize the first Bretton Woods arrangements, because it was one empire trying to prevent the other one from becoming an empire. And a friend reminded me yesterday there were no African countries at the Bretton Woods conference. So we are in a very different place now from where we were then. And I also want us to bear in mind that we should be careful about the claims that we have, particularly in high-income countries, that industrial policy is back. I was reading the other day the Green Party's view of industrial policy in Germany, and it's all about market signals. So I think we have an uphill battle. Industrial policy doesn't mean what it used to, and I think that's a very effective strategy that capital has in some ways, that it manages to take concepts from the progressive vocabulary and reshape them and use them in what seems to me a never-ending struggle. But yes, there are reasons to be optimistic, because there are people who continue to believe that it's possible to fight it. And if I have to end in some positive note, I'll remind us, speaking of Cuba, the words of Che Guevara, be realistic and dream the impossible. If it was possible then, it might be realistic now. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you, panelists, for sharing your thoughts with us today, and thank you for joining this discussion. This talk has been recorded on YouTube, and we're going to share a link in the chat. To receive updates on our publications and events, you can subscribe to receive updates from our Global Economic Governance Initiative. A link will also be posted in the chat to sign up. Thank you all, and see you next time.
Thank you, Bill.